Well, this morning we're going to talk about Stanford University's proposal to expand by 2.3 million square feet, which would enable additional population on campus of about 10,000 people. Bringing us the perspective of Santa Clara County, we're really pleased to welcome Santa Clara County Supervisor and Board President Joe Simitian. Welcome to the program today.
Thanks so much.
Now, you were intimately involved in the prior general use permit application in 2000. And again, you're running point on this one, but there's some differences in process. This potential development agreement is on the table. So I thought we'd start there. If you could explain what the development agreement process is and why the board decided to go forward with that.
Sure. We've got an application from Stanford, as you've indicated, for a significant amount of development. It is going through the development process, just as any application does. Along the way, the issue arose as to whether or not there might be some benefit in having a conversation about something called a development agreement, sometimes shorthanded as a DA. And a development agreement is just a bilateral contract. It's a negotiated document that says, hey, we can give you these benefits, and in exchange, we'd like these benefits. It was something that the university had asked us to consider. It's not something we've done before at the county, so this is a new thing for us. And ultimately, the board decided, and I agreed, that we would give it a try and see if there were some additional benefits that we might derive through a development agreement. There's no guarantee that that'll happen. We could meet, negotiate, and say, nope, not going to work. The thing I am most anxious about is that we not start to negotiate or bargain around conditions of approval that we could and should simply impose on a project if and when it was approved. So I think we have to be a little careful about not thinking that everything is on the table in the sense of a negotiation, but if there are some additional benefits that can be derived and they're mutually agreeable, I'm certainly open to that.
Given that the development agreement process and contract negotiations in general are almost by nature more private than the typical AAR process we're used to, what is the board doing to make sure that the public has a chance to get involved and that the process remains transparent?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a legitimate concern, and I expressed the concern when the subject came up at Board of Supervisors. A couple of things that I think are important. The first is just to have an opportunity for the public to weigh in conveniently, locally here in Palo Alto, along the path of the negotiations. So, as you will recall, we had a public hearing on the 29th of November. That was designed to make sure that the public had an opportunity before we ever sat down with the university to say, here's what we think you should be talking about, here's what we don't think should be on the table. A good crowd, probably 150 people, maybe 50 people spoke. We'll have another couple of those. Again, they'll be local. And not only will the county staff and I be there, but one of my colleagues from the Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Cindy Chavez, who is the other member of the board who's working on this development agreement conversation, will be there as well. So there'll be points along the way before we even sat down, as I said. Then if we get to sort of a set of tentative deal points, there'll be another opportunity to weigh in, and then certainly before there's any final action by the full 5-member board. The other thing that I think is important, and bear with me, it's a little process-oriented, but the original suggestion from one of my colleagues was that we do the development agreement and have it all wrapped up before we started to go through the approval process. That's the conventional land use process. And I pushed back on that, as did others, and said, whoa, wait a minute. That's a little backward. You can't negotiate a deal without understanding the entire context and without giving the public an opportunity to be heard. As originally proposed, the notion was that we'd get this all wrapped up before the final environmental documents were released. And I said, I've got 1,000, if not thousands, of comments. You try and get to a yes on a development agreement before we even had a chance to look at those comments. All hell's going to break loose, and appropriately so. So part of it is like, let's just make sure we don't put the cart before the horse. And then part of it is let's just make sure we check in with the public at every point so that they both know what's happening and have an opportunity to comment on it.
Is there a difference in the environment politically or in terms of citizen activism now that would make the development agreement more appropriate or potentially beneficial than 2000?
Yeah, I'm not sure that certainly the world has changed since the year 2000 when we went through this exercise the last time, and coincidentally I was on the board the last time when we did this, so I have the benefit of having had that experience once before. I'm not sure that it has a lot to do with whether or not a development agreement makes sense this time around or not. It's just a different tool, and it's, I think, most useful as a tool when there are issues that we might not be able to impose. We might not be able to impose a mitigation on the university, or we have fewer tools. And I'll just be out front with it. It's, I think one of the areas where we don't have as many tools as we'd like is in terms of public education. This is, sort of a key issue for the community, and yet, if you're talking about an additional school site, both the cost of land, the location, finding a site, also the construction cost, we don't have much in the way of flexibility that's established by state law, and candidly, the developer fees that the district could impose are clearly inadequate if a new school is required. Similarly, education finance, a subject that I know more about than I wish I did, by virtue of my prior work in the state legislature and as a Palo Alto school board member back in the day. Those funding formulas are established by the state, and because Palo Alto Unified School District is what we used to call a basic aid, now called a locally funded school district that's funded primarily with local property taxes. That means that an institution like Stanford University that doesn't pay, for the most part, doesn't pay local property taxes because they're exempt, would potentially bring in more students without additional revenue, and that's obviously a concern to the school district. Real concern, legitimate concern, but we don't have a lot of tools, frankly, at the county level as a land use authority to help with that. So that's a place where in the development agreement we could have the opportunity to say, well, could you help in this way or that way? That being said, the university is going to say, well, if we provide that benefit, here's what we'd like to see in the way of a commensurate benefit. So it's not so much that the climate has changed, it's just that there are some places where if we have fewer tools to work with, then the possibility of negotiating something through a development agreement makes sense. I will say, here we are 18 years later since we did the first GUP back in the year 2000. At the risk of stating the obvious, traffic and housing costs are worse, not better. We do have the benefit of having laid, I think, a good foundation almost 20 years ago in terms of the existing GUP. I mean, there are things that we now take for granted and shouldn't that were a big deal 18, 20 years ago when we negotiated the first time. The protection of the open space above Junipero Serra, well, that was something we accomplished 20 years ago with great support from the community. The notion that there would be housing mitigation, at least somewhat commensurate with the level of development, that was something we accomplished 20 years ago and laid down. The notion of no net new trips, that was something that was a big deal 20 years ago. Now it's sort of something we take for granted, and in fact I say, how can we do it better? How should we do it better?
Given that the last GUP process accomplished all these things you just mentioned, are there other things besides schools that you think a development agreement could get from Stanford that kind of process cannot?
Well, I think the other potential use for a development agreement is to see if there are ways to do things that are where there's a win-win, where my mantra through this whole thing is and has been and will be full mitigation. What I've said all the way along in the conversation, whether I'm talking to somebody from the university or a member of the public, is look, I'm open. I'm going to keep an open mind right through the end of the process. But the starting point is, if you have adverse impacts, you have to mitigate them, because otherwise they're going to be borne by the community. So whether that's transportation, whether that's housing, my repeated refrain is going to be, how are you going to mitigate that impact? Because if you don't, it'll be borne by the community. Excuse me. So back to the development agreement process, it's possible that we might say, well, housing, we expect full mitigation. And the university could say, well, could we do it this way rather than that? That might get you not only everything you want, but more, but it would be easier for us to do it that way. sort of a more interest-based bargaining approach for those who are familiar with that process. But, it does allow for some of those conversations. And as I said, as long as there's a way to keep that process transparent, I'm open to it. But I've been very clear about saying, look, if we don't get to yes, we don't get to yes. And we just go back to the two other tools we have, which are the conventional land use approval process, and also the ability to simply pass a local ordinance that deals with some issue of development. I know you followed the housing mitigation fee and the inclusionary zoning ordinance, both of which were designed to deal with making sure that development, without regard to the GUP particularly, that development on the Stanford lands doesn't create an adverse impact on housing, and that to the extent it does, that we have funds to create some measure of affordable housing in response.
So with an open-ended process like the development agreement, I'm just curious, where do you start and how do you structure that? I mean, do you take the general use permit application as your framework in negotiating with Stanford? Do you take it section by section? Or?
Well, you start by saying, so, all right, university, you asked for this process. What is it you'd like to talk about? Mm-hmm. And then, all right, county, you've agreed to this process. What is it you'd like to talk about? I've shown my hand a little bit here by saying I think education issues ought to be front and center. To me, that's the one area where obviously we have fewer tools in the other more conventional arenas. As I said, I do have a concern, and it's going to be a concern from the beginning to the end, that it not be an opportunity for someone to say, well, let's negotiate over something that we really should just say, no, here is the expectation in terms of mitigation. We have to avoid negotiation creep, I guess I'll put it that way.
I understand from the county's standpoint, and maybe the communities, that this process could bring more benefits. But from Stanford's point of view, what is leading them into the negotiation process with the county?
I think, excuse me again, I think, you'd have to ask them, of course, but my impression is that given a choice between negotiating or simply accepting an imposed mitigation, the university is always going to say, well, let's talk, let's negotiate. And I think that's an understandable impulse from any developer applicant on a project of this size. Let's see where this goes. Yeah. And that's why there's going to be a certain inherent tension about not letting us wander into territory where we really should just say, look, we're the land use authority, here's our responsibility, let's exercise our responsibility.
Sure.
I do think, one of the things the university has said repeatedly in public forum is that they hope they can get some certainty through a negotiated agreement, because then it's a contract that is binding over a longer period of time. One example is the issue of housing fees. The university objected to the imposition of a housing mitigation fee. It's a significant number. They've threatened litigation around that issue, but I don't think that's a surprise. And, I think that has prompted them to say, well, rather than be at risk of seeing that number go up again in the future, maybe we can build in some certainty through a negotiated agreement that has a defined period of years and lock in some of the either benefits or protect ourselves against other mitigations coming down the road in the years to come.
Well, it was my impression that that's at least one of the drivers for Stanford's proposal for having the development review process because of their objections to the two ordinances that the county was considering regarding inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning, and the fee that you mentioned. As you know, Stanford made its own proposal in hopes of kind of obviating the need for those ordinances. And I don't believe the county felt that they go far enough kind of in addressing the kind of housing impacts that the expansion would create. So I'm just curious, how much daylight is there before what Stanford is proposing and what the county hopes to achieve with this new ordinance? Well, are they close? Is this something?
I'm sure you can understand if I don't negotiate with the university through the Palo Alto Weekly. But having said that, I used a phrase earlier that I'm going to come back to again and again, and that's full mitigation. The expectation is that 9,610 people are going to arrive on the campus as a result of this development if it's improved in full. So then the question is, how are you going to provide housing mitigation for 9,610 people so that the additional burden isn't borne by the community? Now, there are lots of different ways you could do that, but what I'm going to ask is, does the proposal on the table at any given time fully mitigate the impact. And if the university or any other applicant in a similar process, although this is the only time we've used this process, says, well, we think we can give you the same value but do it a different way. Okay, fair enough. I mean, if somebody was going to pay $100 a year for 10 years and then said, well, could we give you $900 now and calculate the present value, and that might work well for all parties. Okay, that's a legitimate conversation. If on the other hand they were going to give you $100 a year for 10 years and said, could we give you $200? Probably not. I mean, just you kind of have to crunch the numbers and understand there are different ways to get to the same good results. So that's a conversation that I'm open to having, and that I hope and expect others will be open to having. But again, lest I haven't said it enough, full mitigation needs to be the expectation, and that's true whether it's transportation. And I'm going to say to the applicant, the university, you don't really want the community to bear the adverse consequences of your development, do you? And if the answer to that is, well, yes, we do, I think people are going to be a little surprised. And if they say, well, no, we don't, then we can say, great, then let's talk about how we can make sure that there's full mitigation of the impacts. That's in a very complicated conversation, that's for me a very simple baseline to sort of always bring the conversation back to full mitigation. Right, you want to bring more people. How can you do that without making traffic worse for the folks who live and work here already? And I think the university has shown over the last 15, 20 years that they can do a lot to mitigate traffic, whether it's enough in the current environment. And again, I'm not talking about expecting anyone to be responsible for somebody else's traffic impacts or somebody else's housing impacts. But if we're talking about new development that brings new adverse consequences, then we should be asking how you're going to mitigate it. And I think the public is understandably, and I would say appropriately, skeptical because every time a project is approved by any land use authority, the local agency says, oh no, we fully mitigated the impacts. And at this point, the folks saying, really? Because you told us that for every project over the last 20 years, but traffic's worse, housing's more expensive. And so there's an understandable skepticism about whether or not full mitigation has been realized in the past. And I think, that's the skepticism we're going to have to confront in this process.
So on November 29th, the community was voicing their opinions. There's a whole lot of people who spoke about schools. I was wondering if there's anything that stood out in their comments to you that you thought, okay, we really need to be addressing this issue, which maybe hasn't been, as front and center as the other ones.
Well, there are two distinct issues, and they're obviously connected, but that are school issues. One is the issue of does the district need another school site, and if so, where? And the district has passed a resolution. It's got 3 points to it, and essentially what it says is we need a piece of land, and we need it over on the west side of campus if that's where the growth is going to occur and the kids are going to arrive. The second piece is, all right, if we have a piece of land, we're going to have to spend a significant sum to build a school there, so we're going to need school construction costs. And the third piece is unrelated really to the issue of a school or a school site or construction, and that has to do with, if we have more and more kids, but we don't have additional tax revenue to support their instruction, then that means we're going to have fewer dollars per kid, and that's a concern across the district. So shouldn't the university, the school district has argued, shouldn't the university play a role in funding the cost of that education, which, given the current tax exempt status the university enjoys, they would not be obliged to do. As I say, these are areas that are typically outside the authority of a local land use authority like a city or a county, and that's why I think there's room for some conversation about that in a development agreement process. But basically it comes down to a school site and then ongoing funding, and those are not going to be easy issues because there's big money involved, and the ongoing funding issue will involve both a debate about, well, how many kids will there really be? And by the way, will you have declining enrollment? This was an issue that came up at the meeting on the 29th. Will you have declining enrollment otherwise, so actually you won't be? I mean, and then, as I say, the commitment is ongoing, and my experience with the university has been they're more comfortable with things that are one-time only than with things that lock them into a cost over a long period of time.
Sure, that's understandable.
Yeah.
So open space is an issue that came up. There was no addressing of that, the intrusion into the foothills in the GUP application, I believe, that isn't there a 2025 sunset?
Yeah. We have what I would call some extra protections for the foothills that were built into the general use permit back in the year 2000. And those additional protections had a 25-year sunset on them, so they expire in 2025, meaning that we've got about another 6-7 years of protection left. And in the application we received this time from the university, there was no reference to any extension of the existing protections. So, in the view of the applicant, apparently those will simply disappear. I wasn't terribly surprised. I'm guessing that the university didn't feel like it wanted to put down a number, and it's part of the process. I understand it. We certainly have heard from people in the community, and it certainly was a sort of one of the half dozen things I wrote down on my to-do list when we started this process. How do we make sure those protections are extended? And we did a sustainable development study supplement. Long story, I won't go into it, but the short version is, and I see you've got the document, Gennady.
Good book.
Essentially what it says is that, the university could grow on its core campus over the course of the next century, literally, nearly triple in size, and still not be overly dense compared or contrasted with comparable universities. The takeaway for me, and I think for many others, is, so then why would we ever think about moving development up into the foothills above Unipo-Serra Boulevard? And so we've had proposals from the community for everything from protection of the foothills in perpetuity to 99 years. The Palo Alto Weekly editorialized, just so you know, I read the paper, that additional protections for at least 50 years would be called for. But it's, I think it's an issue we're going to have to wrestle to the ground before we get done with this one.
Yeah, it's still out there.
Is the idea of permanent protection of foothills something that could be considered, given your words that you don't know why they would ever need to go to the foothills? Because at least one person proposed at the November 29th meeting to just kind of have permanent protection for the foothills. Is something like that even on the table?
Everything's on the table. Again, I hope you can understand if I can't negotiate with through the weekly on this one. But
I can understand. It'd be nice.
But I think what I will say again is, I think we have every expectation of full mitigation for any of the adverse consequences that come from development, and the foothills protection is clearly, front and center. The last time we had this debate, back in the year 2000, was a quote new issue, and there were folks then asking for permanent protection for the foothills in perpetuity. The university's position was 0, but I, said at the time, I think somewhere between 0 and forever we can find a compromise, and at the time the compromise was 25 years. I think the benefit of the Sustainable Development Study supplement is it says, there's really no reason to be casting a glance up into those foothills for a very long time, if ever. And I think that changes the conversation, and I think that's helpful and important.
I remember last year when we were speaking that you expressed some concern that the public wasn't engaged enough in the GUP application process. Do you feel like that engagement has reached a satisfactory level?
I think we're getting there, and I understand how, I've done this before, and I understand people have lives. They've got competing commitments, and there's only so long you can expect people to stay engaged, and this conversation's been underway for a long time. But what I've also learned over the years is if you don't weigh in early, then the opportunity to make sure your concern gets heard is diminished. So I've been encouraging local cities and community members to participate early, often, and they've been doing a great job. The literally thousands of comments we got on the draft environmental impact report reflects that engagement. The City of Palo Alto, City of Menlo Park, and City of East Palo Alto, others have weighed in with very helpful formal communications, but then we hear from individual members of the public as well. I'm hoping that we're going to bring the full board of supervisors, all 5 members, to Palo Alto so that the community here can offer comment, testify before we take action. As a practical matter, expecting folks from the North County, the area that I represent, to get to San Jose on a Tuesday at 9:30 in the morning to provide their testimony is not really helpful or practicable. So people have stepped up. I hope they will continue. The target is to have a set of decisions on this by the end of June in 2019. Candidly, I think it's an ambitious target. I'm not sure we get there, but I think we should stay on that path if we can. And it's crunch time.
And you made a comment at the November 29th meeting about the fact that cities outside Santa Clara County could also get some relief through affordable housing mitigation fee, which I guess is something that hasn't occurred in the past, but some cities are taking interest now, which seems kind of interesting because the negotiations are between Santa Clara County and Stanford, but of course the impacts of growth could be felt in places like Menlo Park or Portola Valley. So to what extent have San Mateo County cities, for example, been showing interest in this or getting involved? And is there anything else they can do?
Well, a couple things. I have, on my own initiative, I pulled together the 6 different jurisdictions that have land use authority over Stanford lands. I mean, Stanford has 8,000 acres, and it's a bit of a challenge to have a big picture view because those 8,000 acres are in 6 different local government jurisdictions that have authority. So it's not just unincorporated Santa Clara County where 4,000 of the 8,000 acres are. It's the city of Palo Alto, of course. You cover that beat. It's also, some of that land is in Menlo Park, and your sister publication covers that beat. Also Woodside and Portola Valley. So, I've been pulling those folks together to have some of these conversations. Have also been pulling folks in from Redwood City and East Palo Alto because they were also affected and partners. And you're absolutely right, Gennady, as people have understood that there have been affordable housing fees that are available to help mitigate some of the housing pressures, they've said, wait a minute, you mean there are funds we could have applied for and we haven't? And the answer is yes. So I know I've heard directly from both San Mateo County and from the city of Menlo Park and from the city of East Palo Alto. So I think they're going to be more attentive, more engaged, because there's some potential benefit there for them if they are asking themselves, how can the approval process ensure that any adverse impacts we feel get mitigated, not just in Palo Alto, not just in unincorporated Santa Clara County, but in our jurisdictions as well.
Is there a lot of precedent for that? Like one county helping neighboring county, shifting funds?
Well,
I know this is a pretty unique process.
I'm not sure how much precedent there is, but at the risk of stating the obvious, the housing market and the traffic challenges we face are not contained within the artificial boundaries of any one relatively small city. I mean, what happens in Menlo Park affects Palo Alto. What happens in Palo Alto affects Menlo Park. What happens in Stanford affects the entire, North County, from North Santa Clara County and South San Mateo County region. And as someone who has, by virtue of my time in the state Senate, the state assembly, I've represented portions of San Mateo County before. This is familiar territory to me. I have some understanding of the problems and the challenges that they're facing and the opportunities. And so, I've tried to avoid taking a parochial or provincial view about, well, here's where the county line is. 20 years ago, when we were trying to create a homeless shelter that would serve this area, it ended up being that the Clara Mateo shelter in San Mateo County was our best bet. That was on the Veterans Hospital site in Menlo Park. And I did have colleagues who said, well, why would we fund a program in San Mateo County? And I said, well, they're homeless people. They don't have a fixed address. And we're trying to find a venue, and it happens to be just outside these artificial boundaries, but it will serve the folks that we're trying to help. So, I think people get that. But, does it require a little, and, I have that view in part because I know that the area and have represented the area and are from the area that I describe as the Mid-Peninsula. For my colleagues who are San Jose centric, and that's not a criticism, that's been the focal point of their public service, that's a little harder case to make perhaps, and so it'll fall on me and these other communities to help make the case on why they are part of the regional impact and why they can and should be part of the regional solution.
There's clearly a lot of input to gather and a lot of agencies to pull together on this. Looking forward then, the community here, when can they participate again in another meeting? Is one scheduled for the beginning of the year?
The dates are yet to be rolled out. I think the key date as we talk is that the final environmental impact report, including comments and the responses to those comments, will be issued before the middle of December. So, literally next week. And whether it's the first part of the week, last part of the week, I couldn't tell you. But by December 15th, there should be a very hefty document available online. And then in January, February, and March, I think you can expect the public hearings to start ramping up. And, as I mentioned at the outset, in connection with the development agreement conversation, that's a place where I think we are going to have additional public hearings to make sure that people have the opportunity to weigh in and see that they have the opportunity to weigh in as part of that process. So stay tuned.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on this process.
Thank you.
That wraps it up for this edition of Behind the Headlines. Follow all the Palo Alto news on paloaltoonline.com or on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you'd like to support this webcast, you can click subscribe below or hit the thumbs up button. We'll see you next week.